The small-town murder that forced a prisoner onto death row. The first thing Sheriff Dan Mercer saw was the stain on the snow. It was just before sunrise in Maple Hollow, a quiet small town where nothing ever happened. Streetlights still glowed, and the cold air burned the lungs. Near the old grain silos, a woman's scream shattered the silence. Dan ran. In the ditch beside the road lay a young woman, her body twisted, her eyes frozen open as if she had died, trying to understand why. Snow around her was stained dark red. Tire tracks cut through the scene, fresh and fast. Dan knelt, heart pounding. In the woman's hand was a folded piece of paper, crushed tight. Carefully, he opened it. "I know who did it. Don't trust." The message ended there. Before Dan could react, his radio crackled. "Sheriff. Vehicle matching the tracks, leaving town at high speed." Dan jumped to his feet and tore down the road, siren screaming. Ahead of him, a dark sedan swerved wildly, refusing to stop. The chase pushed out of town and into narrow roads lined with trees. Then the sedan slammed on its brakes. A figure stepped out, tall, hood up, face hidden. Dan shouted for them to show their hands. Instead, the figure threw a gun onto the road and ran into the woods. Dan chased, branches cutting his face, boots slipping on ice. The figure disappeared into an old hunting shack deep in the trees. Dan kicked the door. Inside, the air was cold and still. Then a voice spoke from the darkness, calm, familiar, and terrifying. "You're too late, Sheriff." Dan froze. He knew that voice. It belonged to a man who was supposed to be locked behind prison walls forever. Before we go any further, subscribe to this channel, because we don't tell comfortable stories here. Like this video if you're ready for the truth, and comment below. Should Dan have followed that suspect into the woods? Dan found a note inside the shack. "She died because of you." Photos covered the walls, of the dead woman, of Dan's home, of his children. And at the center, a prison mugshot. Across it, written in black marker, "Death row is next." The shack door slammed shut. Something metal rolled across the floor, hissing softly. Dan turned, and the smoke filled the room. That was the moment Maple Hollow's quiet life ended. Before we begin, tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us uncover the darkest corners of the prison system. Now let's step inside. Maple Hollow had always been the kind of town people forgot about. It sat between cornfields and pine woods, a dot on the map most drivers passed without slowing down. One main street, one diner, one gas station, a courthouse so small it shared a wall with the library. People waved when they passed each other. Kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on. Doors stayed unlocked more often than not. Sheriff Dan Mercer had grown up here. He knew every road, every shortcut, every family name. He knew which houses argued late at night, and which ones kept their porch lights on for strangers. That was why the note in the shack hit him so hard. "She died because of you." Those words stayed with him long after the smoke cleared and the shack was searched. There was no suspect inside. No body. No trap left behind. Just fear, planted carefully, like a seed meant to grow. By the time the sun fully rose, Maple Hollow was swarming with flashing lights. State troopers blocked the forest road. Yellow tape wrapped around the grain silos where the woman had been found. News vans rolled in from the nearest city, their antennas stretching toward the sky. Dan stood near the cruiser, rubbing his eyes. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed them, he saw the woman's frozen stare. Saw the photos of his kids pinned to the shack wall. Deputy Lisa Crow walked up beside him, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You need this," she said quietly. Dan took one. "Thanks." They stood in silence for a moment, watching investigators move around the crime scene. Her name was Emily Parker, Lisa said. 27. Worked at the hardware store. Lived alone on Cedar Lane. Dan nodded. He knew the name now. Everyone did. Maple Hollow was already whispering. "She didn't have enemies," Lisa went on. "At least none anyone can think of. No record. No known trouble." Dan stared at the ground. "Someone followed her." "Yeah," Lisa said. "And someone wanted her dead." The medical examiner confirmed it later that morning. Emily Parker had been shot once in the chest. Close range. No struggle marks. No defensive wounds. Whoever killed her surprised her. Or she trusted them. Dan felt that thought settle heavy in his chest. By noon, the town was tense. Parents picked kids up early from school. The diner was quiet, conversations low and nervous. Every stranger felt dangerous now. Dan called a meeting at the station. The building was small, and the room filled fast. State investigators sat at the table. Deputies lined the walls. Everyone looked tired. "We have a homicide," Dan said, his voice steady even though his hands weren't. "And we have a suspect who ran from police." One of the state investigators, a man named Collins, leaned forward. "Sheriff, let's be clear. Do you know who that suspect is?" Dan hesitated. Lisa glanced at him. "I think I do," Dan said finally. The room went still. "Think," Collins asked. Dan swallowed. "The voice I heard in that shack. I've heard it before." "Where?" Collins pressed. Dan exhaled slowly. "In prison." Murmurs spread through the room. "There's a man named Caleb Ward," Dan continued. "I arrested him 12 years ago for armed robbery and assault. He nearly killed a store clerk." Lisa frowned. "Caleb Ward escaped?" "No," Dan said. "That's the problem. He didn't." Collins raised an eyebrow. "Explain." Dan's jaw tightened. "Caleb Ward has been locked up since his sentencing. Life without parole. No transfers. No furloughs. No chance of release." Silence fell again. "So how could he be here?" Lisa asked. Dan shook his head. "I don't know." The meeting ended without answers. Only questions that grew heavier by the hour. Later that afternoon, Dan drove to Cedar Lane. Emily Parker's house sat near the end of the street, small and neat. White siding. Blue door. A flower pot knocked over near the steps, soil spilled like someone had kicked it in a hurry. Inside, the house felt empty and cold. Lisa walked through the living room, gloved hands careful not to touch anything. "No sign of forced entry," she said. Door was unlocked. Dan moved into the kitchen. A coffee mug sat on the counter. Still half full. Cold now. She was in a rush, he said quietly. On the table sat Emily's phone. Screen cracked. Battery dead. Lisa picked it up. "Tech will pull it. Messages, calls, location data." Dan nodded. He turned toward the hallway and stopped. On the wall, near the bedroom door, someone had scratched something into the paint. Not words. A symbol. 3 straight lines crossed by 1 sharp slash. Dan's stomach tightened. "What is that?" Lisa asked. Dan stared at it. Memories crawling up from somewhere he didn't like to visit. "That's Caleb's mark," he said. "He used to carve it into things. Walls. Tables. Even his cell door, from what I heard." Lisa looked at him, eyes wide. "That's not possible." Dan didn't answer. Because deep down, he felt something worse than fear. He felt recognition. That night, Maple Hollow didn't sleep. Sirens echoed through the dark as patrol cars circled the town. Dan sat at his kitchen table, staring at his phone. His house felt different now. Smaller. Exposed. His wife, Karen, stood near the window, peeking through the blinds. "You really think this is about that man?" she asked. Dan rubbed his face. "I don't know what else it could be." Karen crossed her arms. "The kids." "I know," Dan said quickly. "I know. I'll talk to them tomorrow. They'll stay with your sister for a while." Karen's voice trembled. "Dan, what if this isn't over?" Dan looked at her. He wanted to say it would be okay, that this was just another case. But he couldn't lie. The phone rang. Dan answered immediately. "Mercer." "Sheriff," Lisa's voice said. "You need to come to the station. Now." Something in her tone made his heart jump. "What is it?" "We got the phone data back." Dan grabbed his jacket and keys. The station lights were bright when he arrived. Lisa stood near a computer screen, her face pale. "Emily's phone was wiped," she said. "Almost everything deleted. Messages. Photos. Call logs." Dan frowned. "Almost." Lisa clicked the mouse. One thing survived. The screen showed a single voice memo. Timestamp just hours before Emily died. Dan leaned closer. "Play it." Lisa hesitated. Then she clicked. Emily's voice filled the room, shaking, breath uneven. "If anyone finds this," she whispered, "please. I'm scared. I think someone's watching me. He knows things he shouldn't. He said if I talk, people will die. He said the sheriff." The recording cut off abruptly. Dan's heart pounded in his ears. Lisa stared at him. "She was trying to warn us." Dan clenched his fists. "About me?" "No," Lisa said softly. "About him." The front door to the station opened suddenly. A deputy rushed in. "Sheriff, you need to see this." They followed him outside. On the hood of Dan's cruiser lay an envelope. No stamp. No return address. Just his name written in thick black ink. Dan picked it up with shaking hands. Inside was a single photo. Emily Parker. Alive. standing beside a man whose face was half turned away. But Dan didn't need to see the face. He recognized the jacket, recognized the scar on the hand resting on Emily's shoulder. Caleb Ward's hand. Lisa whispered, "That photo was taken yesterday." Dan felt the ground shift under him. Because if Caleb Ward was really in Maple Hollow, then someone had helped him, and someone else was next. Before Dan could speak, his radio crackled to life again. "Sheriff, we got a report. Shots fired near Cedar Lane." Dan spun toward the cruiser. "That's Emily's street." The ambulance lights washed Cedar Lane in red and white as the hardware store owner was lifted onto the stretcher. His name was Tom Reeves, and everyone in Maple Hollow knew him. He fixed screens for free. He let kids sweep the floor for pocket money. Now his blood soaked the sidewalk where he had fallen. Dan stood back as the paramedics worked. He watched Tom's chest rise and fall, shallow and uneven. Tom was alive, but barely, and the words he had whispered, "You'd know him," cut deeper than any blade. Lisa walked up, her voice tight. "Shell casing found near the mailbox. Same caliber as Emily's." Dan nodded. He was silenced. "Or warned," Lisa said. Dan looked at the symbol sprayed on the garage door. 3 lines. 1 slash. Fresh paint. The killer wanted it seen. Wanted it remembered. They cleared the street and locked it down. Neighbors were sent home, told to stay inside. Maple Hollow felt like it was holding its breath. At the hospital, Dan waited in the hallway with Lisa. The smell of disinfectant burned his nose. A nurse walked by, shaking her head. "He's in surgery," she said. "We'll know more soon." Dan sat. He felt old all of a sudden. He thought of Emily, of Tom, of the photos in the shack. He thought of the voice. Calm, confident, familiar. Caleb Ward. Dan had put him away years ago. The case had been clean. Witnesses. Video. A confession after hours of questioning. The judge had handed down life without parole. Dan had believed it was over. Now it was back. Lisa broke the silence. "I ran the prison logs." Dan looked up. And no escapes. No transfers. No missing inmates. Caleb Ward is still listed as incarcerated. Dan leaned forward. "Listed doesn't mean present." Lisa hesitated. "You think the records are wrong?" "I think someone wants us to think they're right," Dan said. The surgeon came out an hour later, pulling off gloves. "He made it," he said. "For now." Dan stood. "Can we talk to him?" "Briefly," the surgeon said. "He's weak." They entered the room. Tom lay pale against white sheets, oxygen mask hissing softly. His eyes opened when Dan stepped close. "Tom," Dan said gently. "I'm here." Tom swallowed. He came to my store," he whispered. Lisa leaned in. "Who did?" "The man," Tom said. "The one Emily was afraid of." Dan felt his chest tighten. "Did he say his name?" Tom shook his head. "Didn't need to. He said he used to know you." Dan closed his eyes for a second. "What did he want?" Tom coughed. "Emily found something. Old files. Court stuff. She came to me because I keep records. Receipts. Old paperwork." Lisa frowned. "What kind of files?" Tom's fingers twitched. "Your case," he said. "The one from years ago." Dan felt like the room tilted. "Caleb Ward's case?" Tom nodded slowly. She said the timeline didn't fit. Someone lied." Lisa's breath caught. "Lied how?" Tom's voice dropped. Evidence moved. A witness changed their story. Dan's ears rang. "Who?" Tom squeezed his eyes shut. "I don't know. But she thought the wrong man went to prison." Silence pressed in. Dan leaned closer. "Tom, who shot you?" Tom opened his eyes and looked straight at Dan, the man from the photo. Dan stiffened. "You saw the photo?" "He showed it to me," Tom said. "Of Emily. He said if I talked, I'd end up like her." Lisa swallowed. "Where did this happen?" "In my store," Tom whispered. "Back room." Dan straightened. "Thank you, Tom. Rest now." As they left, Lisa spoke low. "If Emily thought Caleb was innocent." "No," Dan said quickly. "She thought something was wrong with the case." "That's not the same thing." Lisa didn't argue, but the doubt was there, hanging between them. Back at the station, the team went over the old case. Boxes were pulled from storage. Dusty folders opened. Photos spread across tables. Caleb Ward's face stared up from a mugshot. Hard eyes, thin smile. The scar on his right hand was clear as day. Dan traced dates with his finger. "The robbery happened on June 14th, he said. "Caleb was arrested the same night." Lisa scanned a witness statement. "This clerk said Caleb threatened him with a gun." Dan nodded. And the video showed. Lisa stopped. Sheriff. Dan looked up. The video, she said. It was grainy. Face partially covered. Height estimate off by 2 inches. Dan frowned. It was enough. Lisa didn't look convinced. It was enough because we wanted it to be. Dan stiffened. Are you saying I rushed it? I'm saying, Lisa said carefully, that someone might have helped rush it. The room went quiet. A deputy cleared his throat. We pulled traffic cams from the highway, he said. There's a hit. Dan turned. Where? Near the county line. A dark sedan. Same model as this morning. Lisa leaned over the screen. Plate. Stolen, the deputy said. Reported last week. Dan clenched his jaw. He's moving. They followed the lead to an abandoned farmhouse outside town. The place sagged under its own weight, windows boarded, roof caving in. The air smelled like rot and wet earth. Dan approached slow, gun raised. Sheriff's office, he shouted. Come out now. No answer. They moved in. Inside, the farmhouse was bare except for a table in the center room. On it sat a stack of papers. Lisa picked one up. Court transcripts. Dan's heart sank. Notes were scribbled in the margins. Dates circled. Names underlined. One name stood out. Ethan Blake. Dan frowned. Who's that? Lisa flipped pages. He was a witness. Claimed he saw Caleb near the store. Dan remembered the man. Nervous. Avoided eye contact. Lived on the edge of town. Lisa's voice went tight. He recanted part of his statement later. Said he was confused. Dan stared at the papers. Why would Emily be digging this up now? A sound creaked above them. Dan raised his gun. Upstairs. They moved slowly, step by step. At the top, a door stood open. Inside was a mattress on the floor. Food wrappers. A radio. Someone had been living here. On the wall, written in charcoal, were words that made Dan's blood run cold. Truth comes due. Suddenly, a shot rang out. With splintered inches from Dan's head. He dove, rolling behind a dresser. Gun! Lisa shouted. Another shot. Then footsteps, running. Dan sprinted to the window and saw a figure bolting across the field toward the trees. Stop, he yelled. The figure vanished into the woods. They found something left behind near the window. A wallet. Dan opened it. Inside was an ID. Ethan Blake. Lisa whispered, he's involved. Dan's radio crackled. Sheriff, we just got word. Ethan Blake's house is on fire. Dan felt his heart drop. Any occupants? Unknown. They raced back toward town, smoke already rising in the distance. Flames licked the night sky, bright and angry. Fire trucks screamed past them. When they arrived, Ethan Blake's house was fully engulfed. Neighbors stood back, faces pale. A firefighter ran up. We found a body inside. Dan closed his eyes. Dental records needed, the firefighter said. Burned too badly to identify. Lisa grabbed Dan's arm. If that's Ethan, then our witness is gone, Dan said. And so is the truth, Lisa added. As the flames roared, Dan noticed something carved into the wooden fence, just barely visible through the smoke. 3 lines. 1 slash. Dan felt a chill run through him. Because someone was cleaning up loose ends. And whoever they weren't finished yet. Across town, a phone buzzed inside an evidence locker. A message appeared on the cracked screen. You're getting closer. 1 more to go. Dan didn't see it. Not yet. And that was the most dangerous part. The fire that destroyed Ethan Blake's house did more than leave ashes behind. It changed how Maple Hollow breathed. By morning, the town smelled like smoke and wet wood. Ash drifted through the air and settled on cars, porches, and sidewalks like dirty snow. The burned house stood at the edge of the street, hollow and broken, its blackened frame leaning inward as if it had finally given up. Yellow tape snapped in the wind, but it didn't keep people away. Neighbors gathered anyway, whispering, staring, afraid to say what they were thinking out loud. Sheriff Dan Mercer stood behind the tape longer than he should have. He hadn't slept. His eyes burned. His mind replayed the same images over and over. Emily Parker's frozen face, the unfinished note in her hand, the symbol carved and sprayed across town like a signature. Deputy Lisa Crow walked up beside him, holding a thick folder. Fire marshal finished early, she said. Dan nodded slowly. Let me guess. Gasoline. Lisa nodded. Poured through the living room and hallway. Whoever did it wanted it to burn fast. Dan swallowed. And the body? Lisa hesitated. That pause told him everything. It wasn't Ethan Blake, she said. Dental records confirmed it this morning. Male. Mid-40s. Drifter. Name's Michael Ross. Dan closed his eyes for a moment. Relief and fear collided in his chest. So Ethan's alive. Yes, Lisa said. And someone wanted us to believe he wasn't. Dan stared at the ruins. That means this wasn't about hiding a death. It was about sending a message. They returned to the station, and the tension inside the building felt thick enough to touch. Radios crackled constantly. Deputies whispered in corners. Phones rang with tips, rumors, and panic. Dan spread the old Caleb Ward case files across his desk again. He moved slower now, more careful. He read every page as if he'd never seen it before. Witness statements, evidence logs, timestamps. Lisa sat across from him, flipping through a stack of documents. Emily didn't just stumble onto this, she said quietly. She went looking. Dan rubbed his temples. Why dig up a case from 12 years ago? Lisa pointed to a timeline. Because some things never made sense. Dan followed her finger. The robbery time. The 911 call. The witness sighting. Ethan Blake. Dan's stomach tightened. He remembered Ethan clearly. Nervous. Sweaty. Looking anywhere but at Dan during the interview. He changed his statement, Lisa said. First said he saw Caleb clearly. Then later said he wasn't sure. Dan exhaled slowly. And I pushed forward anyway. Lisa didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Dan leaned back in his chair. He remembered the pressure back then. The town was scared. The victim was well-liked. The mayor wanted answers. The prosecutor wanted a clean conviction. Richard Hale. The name sat heavy in Dan's mind. That afternoon, Dan drove alone to the state prison. The building rose from the ground like a block of concrete regret. Tall fences, coiled wire, guard towers watching every movement. Inside, the sound of metal doors slamming shut followed him down the hallway, each one echoing like a reminder of past choices. Caleb Ward's cell was at the end of the wing. Caleb sat on his bunk, hands folded, staring at the wall. He stood when he saw Dan. Older now, thinner, but his eyes were calm. Too calm. Well, Caleb said, a faint smile touching his lips. If it isn't Sheriff Mercer. Dan stepped up to the bars. People are dying in Maple Hollow. Caleb nodded. I heard. You're still locked up, Dan said. So explain your name showing up all over town. Caleb shrugged. Symbols don't belong to one person forever. Dan leaned closer. Emily Parker is dead. Caleb's smile faded. She shouldn't be. You didn't know her? Dan asked. No, Caleb said. But I know courage when I hear about it. Dan clenched his fists. Did you kill her? No. Did you order it? Caleb laughed softly. I don't have that kind of power anymore. Dan stared at him. Emily believed your case was wrong. That hit harder than Dan expected. Caleb stepped closer to the bars. Did she? Yes, Dan said. And now she's gone. Caleb's voice dropped. Then she was getting close. Close to what? Dan demanded. Caleb held his gaze. The truth you didn't want to see. Dan felt anger flare. I followed the evidence. You followed what was handed to you, Caleb replied. Someone made sure of that. Dan turned and walked away before he said something he couldn't take back. On the drive back, his phone rang. Sheriff, Lisa said. We found Ethan Blake. Dan's grip tightened on the steering wheel. Alive? Yes. He turned himself in. Old water treatment plant. Dan didn't ask questions. He just drove. The water treatment plant sat on the edge of town, abandoned and rusted. Ethan Blake sat on the curb when Dan arrived, knees pulled to his chest, shaking. The moment Dan stepped out of the cruiser, Ethan raised his hands. I didn't kill anyone, Ethan said quickly. I swear. Dan studied him. He looked smaller than Dan remembered. Broken. Haunted. Then talk, Dan said. Inside the plant, the air was damp and cold. Pipes dripped slowly. Ethan's voice shook as he spoke. Years ago, Ethan said, a man came to me. Said the town needed peace. Said Caleb Ward was dangerous. Lisa crossed her arms. Who was he? Ethan swallowed hard. Richard Hale. The prosecutor. Dan felt something sink deep in his chest. He told me what to say. Ethan continued. Said if I helped, I'd be protected. That my family would be safe. And if you didn't? Dan asked. Ethan looked down. He said accidents happen. Lisa spoke softly. Emily Parker found you. Ethan nodded. She said the case didn't make sense. She said the evidence was rushed. She said she was going to you. Dan looked away, guilt burning behind his eyes. That's when the threats started, Ethan said. Calls. Notes. Photos of my house. Then someone burned it down. Dan's phone buzzed. Come alone if you want the rest. A location followed. The old courthouse. Dan felt his stomach tighten. Night fell quickly. Too quickly. The old courthouse stood abandoned at the edge of town, its windows cracked, paint peeling, doors hanging loose. Dan stepped inside alone, gun raised, heart pounding. Sheriff, a calm voice echoed. Richard Hale stepped into the light. Older now, gray at the temples, but still confident, still in control. You did your job back then, Hale said. I just made sure the ending stuck. You killed Emily, Dan said. Hale smiled thinly. She was going to tear everything apart. Footsteps echoed behind Dan. He turned. Ethan Blake stood there, holding a gun. His hands shook violently. Hale's voice was smooth. Choose carefully, Sheriff. Dan raised his hand slowly. Ethan, don't. The gun fired. The sound ripped through the courthouse like thunder. Dan felt the world slow. Someone screamed, and everything that had been buried for 12 years finally came rushing to the surface. The gunshot did not fade the way sounds usually did. It stayed. It hung inside the old courthouse like a living thing, bouncing off cracked walls, rolling across broken floors, shaking loose decades of dust and memory. For a long second, no one moved. Not Dan Mercer. Not Richard Hale. Not Ethan Blake. The smell came next. Sharp. Bitter. Gunpowder. Dan's ears rang. His vision narrowed. Training took over before thought did. He scanned the room fast. Floor, walls, doorways, looking for blood, looking for movement, looking for the next threat. Ethan Blake screamed. The sound ripped through the silence and snapped the moment apart. Ethan dropped the gun as if it had burned him. It clattered across the courthouse floor, spinning once, then sliding until it hit the wall with a dull knock. I didn't mean to, Ethan cried. He collapsed to his knees, hands clawing at his hair. I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to. Dan's eyes locked onto Richard Hale. Hale lay on his side near the judge's bench, one arm pinned awkwardly beneath him. Blood spread across his suit jacket, dark and fast, soaking into the old wood floor. His face was pale, twisted in pain, but he was alive. Very alive. Dan moved. Don't move, he shouted, leveling his weapon at Hale. Hands where I can see them. Hale groaned and raised his good hand slowly. Easy, Sheriff, he said through clenched teeth. You got what you wanted. Footsteps thundered in from the hallway. Dan. Lisa Crow's voice cut through the courthouse as she burst inside with 2 deputies behind her, weapons raised. Down. Everyone down. Ethan stayed on his knees, sobbing. Hale froze where he was. Lisa took in the scene in seconds. The blood. The gun on the floor. Dan standing between them like a wall. Ambulance, Dan said. Now. Lisa moved fast, pressing a cloth against Hale's shoulder. You're bleeding badly, she said coldly. Stay with me. Hale laughed weakly. Didn't think this is how it would end. It's not ending, Dan said. Not yet. Ethan was cuffed and let out, shaking so hard he could barely walk. Hale was loaded onto a stretcher minutes later, pale and silent, his eyes never leaving Dan's face as he was wheeled away. The courthouse emptied, but the weight of what had happened stayed behind. Dan stood alone in the courtroom after the others left. The building creaked softly, settling back into stillness. Dust drifted through the air where the gunshot had torn it loose. He looked at the spot on the wall where the bullet had struck. An inch difference. An inch closer to the heart, and everything would have ended there. But it hadn't, and somehow, that felt worse. Richard Hale survived surgery. Barely. The bullet had torn muscle and shattered bone, but missed the artery by luck alone. Doctors said he would recover, though his arm might never be the same. Dan waited until morning to see him. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beep of machines. Pale light filtered through the blinds, painting everything gray. Hale lay propped up against pillows, one arm strapped to keep it still. He looked smaller now, weaker, but his eyes were sharp. You should have let me die, Hale said as Dan stepped inside. Dan closed the door behind him. That would have been easier. For you. Hale smiled faintly. For everyone. Dan pulled a chair closer and Saturday. Emily Parker is dead because of you. Hale exhaled slowly. She was reckless. She was honest, Dan said. You framed a man. You threatened witnesses. You built a career on a lie. Hale turned his head away. I built peace. Dan leaned forward. You built silence. Hale laughed softly, then winced as pain shot through his shoulder. You think the truth fixes everything? You think the town wanted chaos. They deserve the truth, Dan said. They deserve justice. Hill looked back at him. Justice is just a story we agree on. Dan placed a folder on the bed. Emily found these. Financial records. Pressure on witnesses. Notes from your office. Payments that never went through official channels. Hill stared at the folder. She was methodical, Dan continued. She didn't guess. She proved it. Hale closed his eyes. She wouldn't let it go. So you killed her. Hale opened his eyes again. I didn't pull the trigger. No, Dan said. You just aimed everyone else. Silence stretched between them. You're going to talk, Dan said. About everything. Or the truth will come out without you. Hill didn't answer, but his jaw tightened. Maple Hollow woke up to headlines it never expected to read. Former prosecutor shot in courthouse confrontation. Questions raised about old conviction. Small town reckons with past. Reporters crowded the streets. Cameras lined the sidewalks. People whispered openly now. About Emily, about Caleb Ward, about how quickly everything they believed had started to fall apart. Dan stayed off camera. Instead, he drove back to the prison. The hallways felt longer this time. Louder. Each door slammed shut behind him like a reminder of every decision he had made. Caleb Ward stood when Dan reached his cell. You look like a man who finally stopped lying to himself, Caleb said. Dan stopped at the bars. The prosecutor is in custody. Caleb nodded once. Good. The case is being reviewed, Dan said. Everything. Caleb studied him carefully. And you? Dan swallowed. I helped put you here. Yes, Caleb said calmly. I'm sorry, Dan said. The word fell flat. Thin. Too small to carry the weight of 12 years. Caleb didn't respond right away. He turned away, then back again. Sorry doesn't give me back time, he said. It doesn't give me back my life. Dan nodded. I know. So why are you here? Caleb asked. Because Emily died for the truth, Dan said. And because I won't let her die for nothing. Caleb's eyes searched Dan's face. Truth has a cost. I'll pay it, Dan said. Caleb said nothing more. That night, Dan sat alone in his kitchen. The house felt empty without his family. Every sound felt louder. Every shadow felt closer. He poured a glass of water and didn't drink it. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. You think it's over. Dan stared at the screen. Another message followed. IT isn't. His chest tightened. He typed back. Who is this? The dots appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. Then a new message. Check the evidence room. Dan didn't hesitate. The station was dark when he arrived. Too dark. Most of the lights were off, leaving long shadows in the hallways. The place smelled like old paper and stale coffee. He unlocked the evidence room and stepped inside. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with boxes and sealed bags. Years of cases slept behind tags and tape. Dan went straight to the shelf marked Ward, Caleb. The box was open. Files lay scattered across the floor like someone had dumped them in a hurry. Dan knelt and picked one up. Empty. Another folder. Empty. His stomach dropped. Footsteps echoed behind him. Dan spun, gun raised. A figure stood in the doorway, half hidden by shadow. Looking for something? The voice asked. Dan felt his blood turn cold. He knew that voice. It belonged to Deputy Mark Jensen. One of his own. What did you do? Dan asked quietly. Jensen stepped into the light. His expression was calm. Too calm. I cleaned up a mess. Dan kept the gun steady. You helped Hale. Jensen shook his head. I helped the town. Dan's voice hardened. You helped kill Emily Parker. Jensen's eyes flickered. She wouldn't stop digging. Because it was wrong, Dan said. All of it. The transfer van was already an hour ahead. That single fact hit Sheriff Dan Mercer harder than any gunshot had. Harder than the fire. Harder than Emily Parker's death. Because now the truth wasn't just buried. It was moving, fast, behind locked doors and armed guards, toward a place where mistakes became permanent. Death row. Dan stood beside his cruiser at the grain silos, cold wind biting through his jacket. Deputy Mark Jensen lay cuffed on the frozen ground, blood darkening his shoulder where the rifle round had hit him. Jensen was breathing, alive, and for the first time since all of this started, that mattered more than revenge. Lisa Crow was already on the radio, voice sharp and steady. All units, be advised. We have confirmation of a prisoner transfer in progress. Suspect name, Caleb Ward. Repeat, Caleb Ward. Destination, State Death Row Unit. We need intercept now. Static answered her. Then a voice. Copy. We're checking routes. Dan clenched his fists. Which route would they take? Lisa looked up. Highway 17 or the back county road. Dan didn't hesitate. Highway 17. Lisa nodded and ran for the cruiser. As they sped off, sirens screaming, Dan's mind raced. Caleb Ward had been convicted once on lies. Now the same town, the same fear, the same people were doing it again. Only this time, they wanted his life. Dan thought of Caleb's words in the visiting room. Death row isn't a place. It's a decision. Someone had already made that decision. The highway stretched ahead, empty and gray. Winter clouds hung low, pressing down on the world. Dan pushed the cruiser harder, the engine whining in protest. Lisa glanced at the clock. If they don't stop, they will, Dan said. One way or another. They spotted the van 10 minutes later. White. No markings. 2 escort vehicles, one ahead, one behind. State plates. There, Lisa said. Dan hit the siren again and pulled out, closing the distance fast. He keyed the radio. State transport, this is Sheriff Mercer. Pull over immediately. No response. The lead escort vehicle sped up. They're not stopping, Lisa said. Dan felt anger surge. Then we make them. He pulled alongside the rear escort, lights flashing. The driver glanced over, eyes wide, then shook his head. Lisa grabbed the loudspeaker. This transfer is compromised. You're transporting an innocent man. The driver looked forward again. The van began to drift toward the exit ramp. They're taking the county road. Lisa shouted. Dan swerved, tires screaming, barely making the turn. The road narrowed. Trees closed in. No streetlights. Just dark and speed and danger. This is insane, Lisa muttered. No, Dan said. This is planned. The lead escort slammed on its brakes suddenly. Dan barely avoided rear-ending it. Doors flew open. Guns came up. Dan stopped and stepped out, weapon raised but not pointed. Stand down, he shouted. This transfer is illegal. A state officer stepped forward. We have orders. Dan's voice shook with controlled rage. Those orders are based on falsified evidence. We have a confession. We have suspects in custody. The officer hesitated. That's above my pay grade. The van's engine revved. Dan spun. Don't. The rear doors burst open. Caleb Ward stepped out, shackled, flanked by 2 guards. He looked thinner, older, but his eyes were clear. He saw Dan and nodded once. That small gesture nearly broke Dan. Lisa moved closer. Caleb, we're getting you out of this. One of the guards raised his weapon. Back up. Dan stepped between them. No more. The forest was silent around them. No birds. No wind. Just breath and fear. Then sirens approached from behind. County units. State units. Back up. The officer in charge lowered his gun slowly. This transfer is suspended, he said. Until further notice. Dan let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Caleb looked at him through the bars of the open van door. You're running out of time, he said quietly. Dan nodded. I know. By the time they returned to Maple Hollow, the town was awake. News had spread. Again. This time, it wasn't whispers. It was shouting. People gathered outside City Hall. Outside the station. Outside the diner where Emily used to drink coffee on her breaks. Signs appeared. Justice for Emily. Free Caleb Ward. Tell us the truth. Dan watched from the station window as neighbors argued on the sidewalk. Some were angry. Some were confused. Some were scared. Lisa stood beside him. The mayor's office is dark, she said. He didn't come in today. Dan nodded. He knows it's over. But does the town? Lisa asked. Dan didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the holding room where Mark Jensen sat, cuffed to a metal bench, pale but alert. A bandage wrapped his shoulder. Jensen looked up and smiled weakly. You won't win this. Dan sat across from him. You killed Emily Parker. Jensen shook his head. I removed a threat. Dan leaned forward. She trusted us. Jensen's eyes hardened. She trusted the wrong people. Dan placed a recorder on the table. You're going to tell us everything. Jensen laughed softly. And if I don't? Dan's voice was calm. Then the truth still comes out. With or without you. Jensen stared at the floor for a long time. Then he sighed. Hale was scared, he said. The mayor was furious. Emily had files. Real ones. Bank records. Notes. She was going to burn them all. So you killed her, Dan said. Jensen nodded once. I followed her to the silos. She tried to run. She begged. I didn't listen. Lisa closed her eyes. And Caleb? Dan asked. Jensen smirked. He was useful. A story people already believed. Dan felt something inside him snap. You don't get to decide who lives and dies, Dan said. Jensen looked up. Someone always does. The confession broke everything open. By nightfall, Richard Hale formally confessed from his hospital bed. The mayor resigned. Charges were filed. Emergency hearings were scheduled. The state halted the death row transfer. Caleb Ward was moved back to protective custody. Maple Hollow watched it all unfold on television screens, phones, and front porches. Dan returned to the grain silos alone that night. The place was quiet now. No tape, no lights, just wind and metal and memory. He stood where Emily had died and closed his eyes. I'm sorry, he whispered. Not just to Emily. To Caleb. To the town. To himself. A week later, Dan sat in the courtroom again, but this time, the room was full. Caleb Ward stood at the defense table, hands free, eyes steady. The judge read the ruling slowly. Based on new evidence, prosecutorial misconduct, and falsified testimony, the conviction of Caleb Ward is hereby vacated. A gasp moved through the room. Caleb closed his eyes. Dan felt his chest tighten. The judge continued. The state will not seek retrial. Caleb was free. Outside, cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. Caleb stopped beside Dan on the courthouse steps. You kept your word, Caleb said. Dan shook his head. It doesn't erase the years. No, Caleb said. But it ends the lie. They stood there for a moment. Two men shaped by the same mistake. Lisa joined them. Town's going to need time, she said. Dan nodded. So will I. Caleb looked out at Maple Hollow. Truth always costs, he said. But lies cost more. As Caleb walked away into a world he hadn't known in 12 years, Dan felt something settle inside him. Not peace, but responsibility. Because small towns remember. And sometimes, the most dangerous thing isn't the crime. It's the story people choose to believe. When the cameras left Maple Hollow, the town didn't suddenly heal. There were no parades. No clean ending. No moment where everything felt right again. What remained was quiet, and not the peaceful kind. The kind that settles after a storm when people walk through what's left of their homes, touching broken things, realizing that what was damaged cannot simply be rebuilt the same way. Emily Parker was buried on a cold morning. The whole town showed up. People who had never spoken to her stood beside people who had known her their entire lives. They didn't talk much. They just stood there, heads down, listening to the wind move through the trees. Emily didn't get to see the truth come out. She didn't get to see the files opened, the lies exposed, the story rewritten. But she was the reason it happened. Caleb Ward walked out of the courthouse a free man, but freedom didn't feel like a victory. 12 years of his life were gone. 12 years of birthdays, holidays, quiet mornings, and ordinary moments that never come back. People asked him how it felt. He never gave the answer they wanted. Because how do you explain losing time to a lie that everyone agreed to believe? Sheriff Dan Mercer stayed in office, but he was no longer the same man. The badge didn't feel lighter after the truth came out. If anything, it felt heavier. He had done his job the way he was taught. He had trusted the system. He had trusted people in power. And that trust had helped put an innocent man in a cage. Dan stopped locking his office door. He wanted the files visible, open, accessible, because silence was the thing that almost destroyed everything. Deputy Lisa Crow became the person people went to when they didn't know who else to trust. She listened more than she talked. She wrote everything down. She learned from Emily's mistake, not digging quietly, not carrying the truth alone. Truth needs witnesses. Mayor Grant Holloway disappeared from public life. His resignation letter talked about stress and personal reasons, but the town knew better. Some people defended him. Some said he did what he thought was right. Others said that thinking like that was exactly the problem. No one vandalized his house. No one threatened him. That silence was louder than any punishment. Richard Hale lost his career, his reputation, and every case tied to his name was reopened. Some convictions held. Others didn't. Each one carried the same question that now haunted Maple Hollow. Was justice done, or was a story simply made convenient? Mark Jensen went to prison. Not as a hero, not as a protector of the town, but as a reminder of what happens when loyalty replaces conscience. The grain silos still stand at the edge of town. People drive past them every day. Some slow down. Some don't look at all. The blood is gone. The tape is gone. But memory doesn't fade that easily. What happened in Maple Hollow wasn't just a crime. It was a choice. A choice made again and again by people who told themselves they were protecting something bigger than the truth. And that's the most dangerous part of all. Because stories like this don't belong to one town. They happen everywhere. In places where fear speaks louder than facts. Where closing a case matters more than opening questions. Where the wrong person becomes the right answer simply because it's easier to accept. Emily Parker didn't die because she was reckless. She died because she refused to let a lie stay buried. Caleb Ward didn't end up on death row because he was guilty. He was forced there because the system found it easier to reuse a familiar villain than admit a past mistake. And Sheriff Dan Mercer learned something that every system eventually has to face. Justice doesn't fail loudly. It fails quietly. It fails when people stop asking questions. It fails when power goes unchallenged. It fails when silence becomes normal. This story ends here, but the warning doesn't. Because somewhere else, right now, someone is being blamed because the truth is inconvenient. Somewhere else, a file is being closed too quickly. Somewhere else, a voice like Emily's is trying to be heard before it's too late. And whether justice survives depends on who listens. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe.